Another crucial character in what preparing the soil for what later became the Alcoholics Anonymous program was the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. Now, he was a staff psychiatrist at the most prominent mental illness hospital in Europe at the time that Sigmund Freud, quote-unquote, discovered that the humans are driven by forces that their conscious mind is not aware of. Now, people east of Iran will seriously dispute the fact that Sigmund Freud discovered the unconscious, but that's a topic for another video. The important thing as far as our story is that Carl Jung began to use some of the methods of Sigmund Freud at the Berg-Hölzli Institute while he was in Switzerland, and Sigmund Freud was developing his psychoanalysis method in Vienna, Austria. And Sigmund Freud thought that Carl Jung was exactly what he was needed. Sigmund Freud was Jewish. He was surrounded by a lot of bohemian types, and he was not exactly totally accepted by the culture at large. Carl Jung, on the other hand, was a big, strapping, young Swiss Aryan, and he was a brilliant man, and Sigmund Freud felt like he would be much more acceptable to the public at large. The two of them got along quite well as long as Carl Jung was in Switzerland and Sigmund Freud was in Austria. Problems began when American had an idea of bringing the two most prominent psychologists from Europe to meet the two most prominent psychologists from America. And it was on the boat trip over from Europe to America that Carl Jung first started spending a great deal of time with Sigmund Freud, and they found out that there was some very serious disagreements between the two, and that's where the rift first started. Number one, Carl Jung realized that Sigmund Freud basically was setting out to create his own religion with Sigmund Freud as sort of as his own pope, and that he expected Carl Jung to be his emissary to the Aryans, the non-Jews. The second thing is the more time that Carl Jung started spending with Sigmund Freud and started talking more and more about the unconscious, he realized that Sigmund Freud felt like the forces driving our unconscious was a desire for sex. It's also worth noting that Sigmund Freud was a notorious cocaine addict, so that might have clouded his judgment in that area. And Carl Jung told him, gee, I'm having all these patients that think they're Jesus, that think they're Mother Mary, that they think they're Norse gods and goddesses. So there's got to be something more going on here than just a basic desire for sex. Also, Sigmund Freud would tell people just don't even waste time with anybody over the age of 35. They're just too much to pull apart and put back together again to even try, so it's a total waste of time to even try working with anybody over the age of 35. Whereas Carl Jung, that's when he just really started getting interested in people. The whole process of coming to grips with death was something that fascinated Carl Jung. When they got to America and they met William James, at the time, William James was obviously dying. Everybody knew it. William James knew it. And Sigmund Freud looked at William James and thought, oh, isn't he brave, the way he's bravely facing his death. Carl Jung, on the other hand, was absolutely fascinated by William James. And they spent several months during this trip over here. They were together constantly. Now, we don't know exactly what they talked about, but it's obvious that the two, William James and Carl Jung, just seriously hit it off, and they had a lot in common. They had a lot of common interests, and it's those common interests that later got used when Carl Jung was working with a patient named Roland Hazard.